Welcome back to Lucid Science. This week, we're talking about conservation strategies with using surrogate species and groups for conservation planning and management by Wines et al. So let's talk about some terms. Ecosystem services are the multitude of benefits to humans provided by the natural environment and from healthy ecosystems. Examples include food and water, help with soil erosion and regulation of floods, and non-material benefits, such as recreation and spiritual benefits in natural areas. Management objectives are set goals for recovery that are weighed against the management plan to understand the success of a conservation process. Species richness is the number of species that are present in a given ecosystem, community, or region. And endemism refers to species that are only present and native to a single region and are found nowhere else in the world. Okay, let's get into it. Resource managers are tasked with developing management plans that provide ecosystem services and valuable resources, while also protecting native species. Yet, there is often a limited understanding of the ecological needs of local species, and funding is inadequate. In response to this challenge, various surrogate approaches have been proposed to reduce the burden of addressing individual species requirements while also protecting biodiversity. Surrogate species are individual species that can be used to represent a broader set to support conservation and management strategies that cover the ecological needs of multiple species in an area. The management challenge of reducing long lists of species in need of conservation to a more manageable yet realistic set is an issue that ecologists have been confronting for decades. This strategy is visualized in Figure 1. Surrogate species may be used either to represent the species pool as a whole, or to represent the subsets of that pool in species groups, or the groups themselves may be used as representations of the larger species pool. However, specific management objectives are needed in order for this to be effective. Without explicit management objectives, the groups or surrogates cannot be effectively evaluated and used for proper management. So, when are surrogate approaches useful? Figure 2 shows it best. As you can see in the figure, these groups of species are split up based on two variables. Splitting up species into these groups is useful when they share common variables or traits, like habitat and food sources. Given this, the usefulness or feasibility of a surrogate species or group approach depends on both the area of management and the species richness of the system of interest. This approach is best at intermediate levels, where the number of species is not so big that they cannot all be accounted for, and not so small that some necessary species are left out. This is deemed the surrogate zone. This can be seen clearly in Figure 3, where the gray area shows the Goldilocks or surrogate zone of species richness and area, where an array of species can be considered as a whole for management. Species richness, the array of geographical range, level of endemism, and the way that the important species interact with the environment can shift this Goldilocks zone. Importantly, the surrogate zone is more dependent upon the number of species considered rather than the area, which we can see in Figure 4. In a region with few species, the surrogate zone is shifted towards larger areas, denoted by A, compared with an area with high density of species in a smaller region, shown by B. The extent of knowledge of the organisms in an area also influences the feasibility of a surrogate or group management approach. Where information on ecology for potential management responses is lacking for most species, a manager's only options may be to use categories or a surrogate approach to manage the ecosystem without species-specific information. This shows best in Figure 5, where, with growing knowledge about the species and system of interest, the surrogate zone may shift to have a larger area, because more species can be considered individually and a more comprehensive plan can be built. If objectives include the conservation or recovery of many species, usually greater than 50, or are focused on increasing biodiversity, then surrogate species or group approaches may be appropriate. Okay, now that we know what plays into using a surrogate approach, let's talk about the pros and cons. The greatest value of a surrogate or group approach is that it reduces the complexity of a species-rich system into a controllable scope for management. The reduction in complexity streamlines management by focusing on key information and a smaller number of manageable and relevant targets. It is also easier to communicate management objectives and results when they only concern a few species or groups, rather than a mind-numbing array of management targets. Simply put, simple messages are more easily communicated and have greater impact than complex messages. So, what about the costs? Well, some species' needs may not be fully addressed, making it critical to implement well-designed monitoring to detect mistakes before their consequences multiply. Overall, using a surrogate approach may often be less expensive than detailed assessments of individual species in complex systems. But these monetary savings have to be weighed against the costs of potentially misguided management and litigation. Ultimately, it comes down to the best approach given the situation. Establishing what is good enough for this comfort level ultimately depends on one's objectives and the management outcomes expected and realized. Surrogate and group approaches may be especially helpful in this good enough world. That's how surrogate species and groups can be helpful in conserving the world's species today and tomorrow. I hope you learned something new today. Find us on social media at Conservation Made Simple, and I'll see you on the next Lucid Science.